They told you the women were called by God. That was the story, neat, clean, unquestioned. They vanished from their beds, from their families, from the fragile lives they had carved into the wilderness. And then silence. Their names scrubbed from ledgers. Their possessions redistributed like scraps of meat among scavengers. Their families soothed with the same hollow promise. She has ascended to serve. But the truth wasn't holy. It wasn't divine. What lay beneath those revival camps was not a ladder to heaven, but a pit, and once a woman was lowered into it, she was erased. Between 1847 and 1853, 378 women disappeared from religious encampments scattered across Pennsylvania's hill country. That's not hearsay. That's not myth. That's recorded absence, systematic and deliberate. You can hear it in the silence of the records, in the careful precision of what was destroyed. A demolition crew stumbled on the first real crack in the story when they tore down the New Light Methodist camp in Clearfield County. Beneath the warped pine floorboards of its abandoned meeting hall, they found something that made hardened men vomit into the weeds outside. For 3 months, the site was locked under county seal. No press, no visitors. And when the hall was finally leveled, the official statement was that no evidence of wrongdoing had been found. But someone lied. I know they lied. Because one worker wrote a private letter to his brother in Ohio, letters that never reached their destination, intercepted and buried in archives nobody was supposed to touch. In those letters, he described rows of small cavities beneath the floor, lined in black cloth, each with remnants of bone that had been carefully shaved. Do you understand what that means? These weren't graves. They were containers. They weren't meant to return to dust, they were meant to be used. The doctrine that consumed those women was not Christianity, not revivalism, not anything that could be preached from a pulpit under daylight. It was something older, something parasitic, hidden in the body of the church like a tumor. And here's the truth, the reason you've never heard this. It worked. The ritual worked. That's why they buried it. That's why entire denominations colluded in silence. Because once you know what those women were for, once you feel the edges of the doctrine that erased them, you can't go back. He appeared out of nowhere, no birth record, no family history, no paper trail that tied him to any town or church. The only fragments we have come from testimony written decades later, when memory had already been warped by fear. He called himself Brother Ezekiel Morai. Some whispered he had studied at Princeton Seminary, though no professor's roll book ever listed his name. He claimed divine visions in the wilderness, but no one could trace where he had lived before appearing on the western frontier. Men without origins are either liars or something else entirely. The hill folk didn't care. Credentials were for the cities. What mattered was presence. And when Morai preached, his presence filled a room like smoke choking a fire. Women collapsed in trances. Hardened men wept uncontrollably. Children spoke words they had never been taught. He could call storms with uncanny accuracy, predict sickness before symptoms appeared, and most terrifying of all, claimed he could read the condition of a soul simply by looking into someone's eyes. Understand this. On the frontier, where death could arrive in the form of typhoid, famine, or bandits, people clung to anyone who promised safety. But Morai didn't offer comfort. He offered power, salvation through total surrender. Not to the church, not to scripture, but to him. I am but the vessel, he would thunder. But through me, God whispers his will. That single line became law inside the camps. And if you think men are hard to bend, understand that his words targeted women with surgical precision. He told them that the corruption of the world had always been carried through the flesh of Eve. That women bore within them a gateway unclean, but also sacred. And only through purification under his doctrine could that gateway be redeemed. He called his movement the New Light. Not the new light of the revivalists in New England, no, this was a different fire. A darker flame. He built his first camp in 1847 on a hidden plateau above Little Toby Creek. Its design was deliberate. A central meeting hall cloaked in shadow, cabins for families, a dormitory for unmarried women, and his private retreat carved into the hillside like a tomb. The entire place fenced off with 8-foot walls. They said it was to keep out bears. But once you see the diagrams, you realize it wasn't built to keep anything out. It was built to keep something in. The first woman erased was Sarah Weatherby, a mother of 6. She wasn't frail, she wasn't sickly, she wasn't wandering. She was chosen. That's the word Morai used, chosen. Her husband Abraham was told that Sarah had been called to serve in a higher chamber, a phrase no one outside the inner circle understood. When she vanished, Abraham didn't fight. He didn't question. He told neighbors calmly, faithfully, that his wife had ascended. Imagine that. A man raising 6 children alone, clinging to the belief that his missing wife had been handpicked by God himself. That's not devotion. That's control. This became the rhythm of the camp. Women between 16 and 40 were marked, slowly separated from their families, and then gone. No funeral, no grave, just the hollow explanation. She has transcended. And here's the dark genius of it: he never took them in secret. He took them in ritual. Entire congregations were conditioned to watch, to pray, to chant, while a woman was led away by Morai and his 3 assistants, the so-called vessels of light. By dawn, the bed was empty, her belongings already divided, her name scratched from the community's record book as if she had never drawn breath. They called this process elevation. It was framed as an honor beyond comprehension, a surrender of earthly form so complete that no trace remained. Do you see the precision? The doctrine erased the very idea of resistance. If a woman cried out, she wasn't resisting Morai, she was resisting God. If a husband begged for his wife, he was branded weak in faith. Every disappearance reinforced the cage around the others. Each vanishing was proof that the ritual was real. But the cracks showed early. Sarah's sister, Mary, came to the camp demanding answers. She met privately with Morai and emerged white as a corpse. She begged her husband to leave at once, abandoning her possessions, refusing to speak of what she had heard. That silence tells you everything. Something was confessed to her in that room, something so vile, so certain that she never dared put it into words. By January 1848, the first night of revelation was staged. The chosen was a young bride, Rebecca Stoltzfus. The entire camp gathered in the dim hall, chanting until they shook, until reason collapsed. At the peak of frenzy, Morai laid his hands on Rebecca's shoulders and declared, "She will ascend tonight." She walked out smiling, glowing, her voice steady. "Do not mourn. I am not dying. I am being born into a higher light." By sunrise, her bed was empty. Her husband wept, but no one comforted him. They told him to rejoice. The doctrine of elevation wasn't spoken aloud in full. It lived in fragment-shaft sentences, murmured prayers, cryptic lines scratched into Morai's journals. But enough survived to expose its core. To him, women were not merely believers. They were conduits, gateways. He preached that God's true fire could not be housed in ordinary flesh. It required vessels purified through surrender. And purification demanded sacrifice, not death in the ordinary sense, but transformation through what he called the chamber of the new light. This chamber was carved into the hillside behind his retreat, a low cavern lit only by oil lamps, the air thick with smoke and iron. Witnesses who later escaped the camp described the muffled chanting that seeped from its walls on nights of elevation. No man or child ever entered idly Morai, his 3 vessels, and the chosen woman. The others were commanded to remain in prayer until dawn. And when dawn came, the woman was gone. Not one body was ever returned. Not one grave ever marked. But here is where it turns. Years later, when demolition crews dismantled the abandoned camp, they discovered what the worshippers had never seen. Beneath the floorboards of the meeting hall, rows of shallow cavities lined in black cloth. Inside them, shavings of bone. Not whole skeletons. Not natural decay. Shavings. As if each body had been disassembled, scraped, its essence harvested rather than buried. The workers weren't supposed to talk, but one man wrote to his brother describing a smell that clung to the lungs, and ribbons of fabric soaked in something dark that wasn't blood. Not exactly. Those letters vanished into archives under church custody. But copies survive. I've read them, and they tell us what the official histories won't. Elevation was not transcendence. It was consumption. Morai's sermons began shifting after Rebecca's disappearance. He preached that every elevation brought the community closer to holiness, that the light of God was thickening in their midst. His eyes burned brighter. His voice grew more commanding. The vessels began wearing black gloves during services, their hands trembling when touched. Something was being done with those women. Something that left residue in cloth, on bone, on breath itself. This is the part you were never meant to hear. The women were not erased because they failed. They were erased because the doctrine succeeded. If this horror had been contained to one camp, one false prophet, the story would be tragic but explainable. A madman, a cult, an isolated atrocity. But that's not what happened. Within 2 years, the same ritual language, the same design of camps, the same dormitories for unmarried women, the same fence walls appeared in 3 other counties. Jefferson, Elk, and Venango. Different pastors led them. Different congregations filled them. Yet their sermons carried the same phrasing, the same talk of elevation, the same insistence that women between 16 and 40 were vessels of divine passage. This is where the trail turns from madness into system. These weren't copycats. These men weren't improvising. They were following a doctrine written, shared, and quietly sanctioned. The records what little survive show letters exchanged between Methodist, Presbyterian, and Lutheran leaders in Philadelphia. The language is cautious, cloaked in euphemisms, but the pattern is clear. They knew. They knew that women were vanishing. They knew property was being redistributed. They knew the rituals were breeding suspicion. And yet they advised containment, not exposure. Their words, "Do not scandalize the revival. Do not imperil the work of the Spirit." Understand what that means. Denominations that publicly argued over Scripture, over baptism, over sacraments came together in private to protect this. When the families asked questions, they were told their daughters had gone to serve in distant missions. When county officials sniffed around, church lawyers arrived with sealed documents. The truth wasn't just hidden by Morai. It was buried by institutions with power, with money, with pulpits that reached across the nation. And here's the most disturbing part. The doctrine spread along invisible lines. Camps didn't advertise their practices. They whispered. They selected families already softened by grief, already fractured by loss. A mother who buried 2 children would be told she was special, that her pain made her a vessel for higher fire. And once she stepped into that chamber, she never returned. By 1850, at least 4 camps across western Pennsylvania had recorded disappearances. In total, 378 women erased. Not runaways, not suicides, erased. Their belongings absorbed, their names struck through, their memories sealed in silence. And every time a rumor reached the city, the denominations closed ranks, rewriting records, assuring newspapers that these were exaggerations of frontier hysteria. This was not hysteria. This was policy. Morai left behind fragment scraps of journals, half-burned papers, marginal notes smuggled out by defectors. Most are gone, destroyed by fire or lost in denominational archives. But the fragments that survived are enough. And they don't read like sermons. They read like translations. Line after line of words not in English, not in Hebrew, but in something older. Languages the church would never admit to teaching. Some scholars have tied them to fragments of Aramaic, others to remnants of Mithraic liturgy, the soldiers' cult that once rivaled Christianity in the Roman Empire. But the most chilling possibility is this, that Morai had stumbled upon, or been given, fragments of a much older rite, the kind whispered in the deserts long before Christ, long before Moses. The theme is always the same: women as thresholds, flesh as a gate, fire as purification, not fire that consumes wood or stone, but fire that consumes identity. Elevation was never about the woman. It was about what could be drawn through her. One passage, barely legible, describes it. She is unmade, so the light may clothe itself. The body dissolves, the vessel remains, the flame is thickened. That phrase, "the flame is thickened," appears again and again, as if the goal was to condense something invisible into form. Where did he learn this? There are whispers of a missionary killed in North Africa in the 1830s, his belongings stolen, his journals never recovered. There are rumors of Morai spending time among Freemason lodges in Philadelphia, trading secrets for protection. But no one can explain the precision of his doctrine. He wasn't improvising. He was restoring something old enough to terrify even the institutions that covered for him. And that's why the denominations didn't expose him. Because to expose him would mean admitting what he had uncovered, that under the skin of Christianity there are older veins of ritual, darker arteries of power, and once in a century, someone cuts into them. Once cut, they bleed forward. Morai wasn't the first to practice this. He won't be the last. His genius wasn't invention, it was camouflage. Wrapping an ancient hunger in Christian language, selling it as revival, disguising parasitism as holiness. That's why it spread so easily. That's why families accepted it. Because no one wants to believe their faith has teeth. But once you see the bite marks, you never forget them. Power doesn't last through violence alone. It lasts through agreement, through the careful breaking and reshaping of human thought until chains feel like choices. That's what Morai mastered. He didn't have to drag women into the chamber kicking and screaming. He conditioned them to walk willingly. And he conditioned the community to clap as they went. How? First, he stripped identity. At the camp, men and women were separated. Families lived apart. Belongings were pooled. Names erased from records as soon as a person disappeared. Even children were taught to forget their mothers quickly, told to repeat. She is not gone. She is serving. The language itself was the weapon. Words were bent until they no longer described reality, but dictated it. Second, he rewired emotion. Grief was condemned as weakness. Husbands who cried for their wives were publicly shamed, told they were defying God's will. Instead, they were praised for celebrating a disappearance, turning mourning into ritual obedience. Imagine the psychological torment. Your wife is gone, your daughter vanished, and if you show an ounce of sorrow, you're branded faithless. Third, he elevated fear into worship. The constant talk of elevation blurred the line between holiness and horror. The very thing people feared most, disappearance, was reframed as divine privilege. You didn't dread being chosen. You prayed for it. And if you weren't chosen, you questioned whether your faith was strong enough. The doctrine inverted survival instinct until death became a goal and absence became proof of presence. But the most disturbing control was subtle. Morai taught that doubt itself was sin. That even thinking a forbidden thought would expose your soul to corruption. People began policing their own minds. They silenced their own questions before he ever had to. This is how domination takes root. Not by locking bodies in cages, but by teaching minds to build their own. And once the mind is reshaped, loyalty is unbreakable. That's why women walked into the chamber smiling. That's why husbands swallowed their grief. That's why entire congregations stayed silent for decades. They weren't simply trapped. They had been remade to believe the trap was salvation. This wasn't just religion. It was psychological architecture. And its blueprint has been copied again and again in systems you see today, systems that want your obedience, not your awakening. For years, no man spoke against Morai. No woman resisted. The disappearances became ritual, predictable, accepted. But in February of 1851, a carpenter named Elias Brandt finally broke the silence. His wife, Lydia, had been marked for elevation. She was 23, newly married, carrying their first child. For weeks she spent long hours in prayer under Morai's watch, her eyes vacant, her voice repeating phrases she couldn't explain. And then one night, during service, Morai called her forward. Elias stood. His voice cracked as he shouted across the hall. No, she will not go. The congregation froze. No one had ever spoken those words aloud. Witnesses later recalled the look on Morai's face, not rage, not shock, but something colder, something like amusement. He lifted his hand and told Elias, "If you deny the Lord his vessel, the fire will consume you instead." What happened next has been pieced together from 3 separate testimonies. The lamps dimmed though no wind touched them. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the room itself was pressing inward. Elias tried to drag Lydia toward the door, but she collapsed in convulsions, her body thrashing as if every nerve had been set alight. Some say her skin flushed red as coals. Others say her eyes rolled back until only white remained. The congregation began to scream prayers, begging God to spare her. Morai stepped forward, placed his hand on her chest, and she went still. Then he turned to Elias, and with that same calm voice said, "The light has chosen, not you, never you." By dawn, Lydia was gone, her bed empty, her name scratched from the records. And Elias? He was led to the edge of the camp, beaten until his ribs cracked, and cast into the forest half dead. He crawled 14 miles before reaching a settlement. What he told them was dismissed as hysteria, the ravings of a broken man. His body was real, his bruises undeniable, but his story was too dark, too dangerous. The sheriff's office filed it away, the churches buried it, and Elias lived the rest of his life as a haunted drifter, drinking himself toward death. But his defiance left a scar. For the first time, cracks appeared in the camp silence. Men whispered. Women looked at the ground instead of Morai's eyes. Doubt had been spoken aloud, and doubt, once named, is a contagion. Doubt is a disease, and every tyrant knows the cure is spectacle. After Elias Brandt's rebellion, Morai understood the risk. If one man resisted, others might follow. Fear alone would not be enough. He needed to transmute that fear into renewed obedience. And so, within weeks, he staged what came to be whispered as the Night of Binding. Unlike the usual private elevations, this one was public. Every member of the camp was ordered into the meeting hall. Children sat on the dirt floor, husbands and wives divided into separate rows. At the center stood a woman named Hannah Weaver, 28 years old, a mother of 2. She had not been chosen for elevation. She had been chosen for something else. Morai announced that Hannah carried the seed of rebellion. That doubt had crept into her spirit, and if it was not purged, the entire camp would be poisoned. He declared her a living warning. The congregation watched as the vessels of light bound her arms with black cords. She was not led into the hillside chamber. She was kept in the hall in front of everyone, as Morai recited prayers in that jagged, unrecognizable tongue. What happened next fractured the minds of those who saw it. Witnesses claimed her body began to seize violently, as if her very blood was boiling. Some swore that shadows gathered around her form, bending unnaturally against the lamplight. Others said the sound was worse than the Satan inhuman shrieking that seemed to pour from her throat and yet not belong to her. It lasted minutes, and then silence. When the cords were untied, Hannah didn't move. Her skin was pale, her lips darkened, her eyes open but lifeless. Morai declared that the light had judged her unworthy, not elevated, not erased, extinguished. Her body was carried out through the back door, never seen again. The lesson was absolute. Elevation was an honor. Resistance was death. Mothers whispered this to their daughters. Fathers bowed their heads in silence. Children learned it as their first law. The doctrine had adapted, tightening like a serpent around every throat. No one dared defy again. And yet, something changed that night. Obedience returned, but it was no longer pure faith. It was survival, which meant the doctrine, for the first time, had created not only believers but prisoners. The story of Morai's doctrine could have ended sooner if anyone outside the camp had truly listened. But silence is not born only from fear. It is also born from convenience. Local farmers whispered about strange songs drifting across the valley at night, voices rising in cadences no one recognized. Hunters claimed to see fires burning in the hills at impossible hours, moving in patterns rather than spreading like flame should. Even travelers along the main road reported children staring from the treeline, their faces pale and still, as if waiting for something. Everyone heard the rumors. Everyone told themselves they weren't their problem. Elias Brandt's testimony reached the sheriff's desk. His bruises were real, his terror undeniable. But the county was poor, stretched thin, and the church's influence deep. No official wanted to ignite a scandal. A sheriff could lose his badge. Priest could lose his flock. So the file was tucked into a drawer, stamped with a single word: unsubstantiated. Meanwhile, ministers from neighboring congregations faced their own dilemma. They suspected heresy, yes, but Morai's following was growing. Families donated land, goods, labor. To denounce him would risk splitting their parishes, driving people away. And so, instead of naming him a fraud, they softened their sermons, warning vaguely of false shepherds, without daring to name the wolf in their midst. The newspapers, too, caught wind. A single article was drafted about peculiar rites in the valley, but the editor killed it before print. Too sensational, he said. Too likely to provoke lawsuits. Better to leave it buried. And so the silence thickened, protecting the very thing it should have exposed. The camp became a ghost on the edge of the map, tolerated so long as it did not bleed into the towns. People comforted themselves with a lie. If something truly monstrous were happening, someone would have stopped it by now. But history teaches a darker truth. Monstrosities thrive not because no one knows, but because everyone knows, and no one acts. Morai understood this better than anyone. He built his kingdom not in isolation, but in the shadow of a society that found it easier to avert its eyes than confront what was festering in its own soil. That silence was his greatest ally, and it would allow him to expand his dominion unchecked for years longer than anyone dared imagine. By 1853, the valley could no longer hold the weight of Morai's doctrine. His flock had multiplied, families swelling under his command, children raised from birth with no knowledge of any world beyond the camp. But isolation had its limits. Food grew scarce, timber thinned, and whispers of doubt, though crushed, lingered like smoke after fire. Morai's solution was expansion. He began sending mission caravans into the town, small groups of men and women dressed in plain, spotless garments, carrying no weapons, speaking only of light and redemption. To outsiders they appeared humble, almost pitiable. They carried hymns instead of threats, scripture instead of coins. And in desperate towns, where crops failed and sickness spread, their presence seemed less like intrusion and more like relief. The message was simple: the world is dark. We are the light. Come and be spared. People listened. Not all, but enough. A widowed mother here, a ruined farmer there, a young man burned by scandal and eager for cleansing. They trickled into the valley like lost sheep, and once inside, the gates of doctrine closed around them. Some never returned to their families. Others did, but when they came back, they carried with them a different gaze, a different rhythm of speech. They spoke in Morai's cadences. They urged their neighbors to listen, to join, to elevate. It spread like an illness. Not openly, not all at once, but subtly, one household at a time. By the winter of 1854, 2 entire families from a nearby township had vanished into the hills. Local officials shrugged. People moved west all the time, they said. People started over. And yet, journals and letters from that period betray another truth. A merchant wrote of strange gatherings at crossroads where hymns were sung until dawn. A schoolteacher noted children who refused to pray in the old way, insisting only Morai's words were true. A farmer's diary recorded his daughter waking at night to stand motionless at the window, whispering that the light is coming. The doctrine was no longer confined. It was seeding itself, silently, invisibly, into the fabric of ordinary towns. Like rot beneath a floorboard, unseen until the whole structure collapses. And Morai? He watched it spread, not with urgency, but with patience. He understood that contagion is slow, but once it takes hold, it becomes unstoppable. The first disappearance did not begin in the valley. It began in a neighboring town, barely 12 miles away. A child, 8 years old, named Clara Hensley. She had gone missing on a gray autumn evening in 1855, vanishing from her family's yard just as the lamps were being lit. Her shoes were found in the mud near the fence line, but there were no other tracks, no drag marks, no signs of struggle. It was as if she had simply walked out of her life and dissolved into the dusk. Her parents, frantic, scoured the fields with lanterns. Neighbors joined, combing the woods until dawn. But Clara was gone. The sheriff posted notices in nearby towns, and for the first time in years, officials found themselves staring into the valley with suspicion. Whispers circulated quickly. Some recalled seeing pale figures on the road days before, men and women traveling with empty carts, their faces veiled, humming as they walked. Others remembered hearing hymns at night, carried on the wind from the hills. A few claimed they saw Clara herself days after her disappearance, standing silently at the treeline, her dress dirty, her eyes glassy. When they called her name, she turned and melted back into the woods. The Hensleys refused to let the matter rest. Clara's mother stormed into the county offices, demanding answers. She swore her daughter had been taken by the people of the valley, that those hymn singers had stolen her. But without proof, the sheriff dismissed it. "Children wander," he said. "The woods are wide." Weeks later, a traveling peddler claimed he had seen a child matching Clara's description deep inside the valley, standing among a group of robed figures. She did not cry out for help. She only stood still, lips moving in silence, as though repeating words he could not hear. When the man reported this, no action followed. His testimony was written off as drunken fancy. But among the townsfolk, fear grew. Parents began locking their doors at night, keeping their children indoors after sundown. The valley was no longer just a rumor. It was a threat. And inside the camp, Clara's fate was sealed. She became the first of many taken not from within, but from without, a declaration that Morai's doctrine was no longer content with willing converts. It had begun to harvest. Clara Hensley was only the beginning. By the spring of 1856, 3 more children had vanished from neighboring towns. Each disappearance followed the same cruel rhythm. Twilight, a moment of inattention, and then silence. A shoe left behind. A doll dropped in the dust. A window left open with curtains swaying in the night air. The valley denied it all. When questioned, Morai's followers spoke with serene calm, insisting they had no need to steal children, for the light draws who it wills. Yet inside the camp, the children were central. Witnesses later described them standing at the center of circles, robed not in white but in pale gray, chanting in unison words older than scripture. Their voices were said to bend the air itself, a sound so shrill and layered that even seasoned adherents trembled when it began. Morai preached that children carried a purity untainted by the false world. Their innocence, he declared, made them perfect vessels. The mouth of a child, he told his flock, speaks closest to the source. To him, their stolen presence was not abduction, but consecration. And his followers, parents and childless alike, accepted it. Some even offered their own sons and daughters to the rituals, believing it would elevate the family's soul. As the pattern of disappearances spread, families outside the valley lived in dread. Doors were barred, windows nailed shut. Fathers took shifts sitting by the hearth with rifles across their knees. Yet still the children vanished. Some left behind cryptic notes in their own hands, phrases no one had taught them. Words like, "I must go to the light," or "He is calling." Others seemed to drift into sleep only to never wake in their beds. Local authorities wavered. Some believed in kidnappers, others in runaways, still others in hysteria feeding on itself. But those who dared to investigate the valley rarely returned unchanged. One deputy resigned after stumbling into a midnight gathering where dozens of children stood in rows, their eyes reflecting torchlight with an animal brightness. He told no one what he had truly seen, only muttering that they weren't themselves anymore. By then, the doctrine no longer needed secrecy. It had discovered something more powerful than stealth inevitability. And every child lost became not a tragedy, but a testimony, folded into Morai's scripture as proof that the light had chosen another vessel. By the late summer of 1856, the patience of the neighboring towns was exhausted. The Hensleys were not alone. 5 more families had lost children to the night. Fear had hardened into fury. Farmers abandoned their fields to gather in meeting halls. Preachers thundered from pulpits that the valley is the devil's orchard. And blacksmiths turned their forges toward weapons instead of tools. For the first time, a coalition was formed. Sheriffs, clergymen, and farmers swore together that they would purge the valley of its poison. They were not an army, but they carried muskets, pitchforks, and firebrands, their resolve sharpened by grief. It was said that even the most pious ministers took up rifles, their sermons turning into battle cries. Yet before they could march, suspicion began to bloom within their own ranks. Strange things happened in the towns. Children who had not vanished still began to sing hymns at night in languages their parents did not know. Whole households refused to join the coalition, declaring that the valley was not to be feared but revered. It became clear, Morai's reach was not confined to the hills. His doctrine had seated itself in kitchens, in barns, in pews. Neighbors who had once shared bread and prayer now eyed one another with distrust, unsure who was truly on their side. Still, the militia pressed on. One autumn evening, torches in hand, they marched into the valley. The hymns began before they even reached the gates, hundreds of voices rising in eerie unison, echoing from unseen hillsides. Men who had sworn to fight found their knees buckling at the sound, their weapons suddenly heavy, their vision blurring as though the very air thickened with each note. When they reached the clearing, Morai was waiting. He did not speak. He did not need to. At his gesture, dozens of children stepped forward, their small hands raised in perfect synchronization, faces blank and glowing in the torchlight. Some were recognized instantly, the missing sons and daughters. The militia faltered. Could they fire on their own children? Could they strike down the very lives they had come to save? That night, the coalition shattered. Some dropped their weapons and fled. Others fell to their knees, overcome, whispering that perhaps Morai was right, that no man could command such obedience without divine sanction. The valley remained untouched, stronger even. For every man who turned away in terror, another bent in submission. After the failed march into the valley, something shifted irreversibly. The coalition had gone in with torches and muskets, but what returned was not an army. It was a scattering of broken men, their eyes hollow, their voices trembling, their faith shattered. Some refused to speak at all, retreating into barns and cellars, rocking in silence. Others began to mutter fragments of Morai's scripture, though none admitted learning it. Within weeks, the collapse spread outward like a contagion. The first town to fall was a small riverside settlement, Williford. Its church bells, once the loudest on Sunday morning, went silent. Travelers passing through found the streets empty, doors unlocked, meals left half-finished on tables. Livestock wandered freely, unclaimed. Only at night did signs of life appear. Pale figures standing in the fields, staring toward the valley, their lips moving in silent unison. When word reached the other towns, fear curdled into paralysis. If Williford could vanish in weeks, what hope did they have? But Morai did not strike each town with violence. He had no need. His doctrine seeped in more subtly. Preachers began slipping his words into their sermons, first as parables, then as scripture. Shopkeepers whispered blessings in the cadence of his hymns. Children drew symbols in the dirt, the same spirals carved on the valley's stones. Entire families vanished not through abduction, but by choice, walking away from homes and farms, leaving everything behind to join the camp. Those who resisted found themselves isolated. In some towns, a single household would remain untouched while every neighbor turned. One farmer in his testimony wrote that he woke to find his entire congregation gone, the pews empty, the hymnals abandoned, save for one book left open to a blank page. He never returned to church again. By the end of 1857, the valley no longer seemed a place apart. It was the heart, and the towns around it were becoming ribsbone growing to protect the doctrine's body. And yet, records from the time show a chilling consistency. Not a single cry for help, not a single letter of protest, not a single rebellion after the first failed march. Only silence, only surrender. By 1858, the valley had no need for secrecy. The doctrine had consumed not only its own people, but the very rhythm of life. Work, rest, family every hour bent to ritual. Farmers no longer sowed or harvested. Fields grew wild, their furrows broken. Blacksmiths abandoned their forges, leaving iron tools to rust. Even mealtimes ceased to be ordinary, transformed into ceremonies where food was not eaten but offered, left to rot at the bases of the carved stones. It was the children who held the center. Witnesses few and unreliable spoke of vast gatherings where dozens of them stood in concentric circles. At the smallest center was always one child chosen for the opening. Their lips would be touched with oil, their eyelids painted with ash, and then Morai himself would whisper into their ear. No one knew what he said, but when the child began to speak, their voice was no longer their own. The words that came forth were in languages unrecorded, their syllables bending the air like heat over fire. Grown men and women collapsed in ecstasy at the sound, clawing the earth until their nails bled. Parents wept not in sorrow but in awe, convinced their child had become the very mouthpiece of the light. What happened to those central children was never clear. Some were seen again, vacant-eyed, wandering the camp like husks. Others vanished entirely, absorbed into the stones, the soil, or the silence. Their absence was never mourned. In Morai's doctrine, there was no death, only transference. Daily acts grew monstrous in their devotion. Families sang hymns through the night, denying themselves sleep. Mothers laid their infants on cold stone floors, letting them cry until their voices failed, as an offering of pure breath. Fathers carved spirals into their own flesh, claiming the blood-traced paths back to the source. And always Morai watched not with the fever of a fanatic, but with the calm patience of a man certain the world had already ended and only his flock remained. By the time the valley was finally abandoned, its date unclear, its reason unrecorded, nothing human was left to reclaim. Travelers who later entered found no bodies, no graves, no signs of flight, only ruins of cabins, toppled stones, and the faint grooves of spirals scratched into tree bark, worn deep as if by centuries instead of years. To this day, the valley is remembered only in fragments. Court testimonies, faded newspaper clippings, whispers carried down through generations. The disappearances were never solved, the rituals never explained. And yet, in certain rural towns, lullabies still linger with words no mother recalls learning, and children still sometimes vanish at twilight, shoes left behind, dolls in the dust. The valley is gone, but the doctrine perhaps never left. If these forgotten rituals unsettled you, imagine what's still hidden in the archives. Stay with memory, lost histories are waiting to be unearthed. The valley may be gone, but the echoes remain. Join me as we keep pulling at the threads of America's darkest past. Do you think the valley's people vanished, or were they taken? Leave your theory below, I'll be reading them all. Some of the details are still missing. If you caught a hidden clue in tonight's story, drop it in the comments. Let's piece this history together. This is just one chapter of a larger forgotten history. Subscribe, and next time we'll go even deeper into the shadows. If this story chilled you, wait until you hear what happened just a few years later in another valley not far from here. If you're brave enough to keep searching with me, the next story is waiting. But remember, some doors, once opened, cannot be closed.